As a fan of the series, there are times where it feels hard to believe that Metroid is as well known and received as it is today. From the outside looking in, you wouldn't really know how flipped the status quo had become either. The past 3 years alone have been nothing but kind to the franchise, with smash hits like Metroid Dread that until its reveal was nothing more than a simple could have been in our head after it faded into the obscurity of development hell all those years ago. And then of course there's Metroid Prime Remastered, which released earlier this year, which brought the Prime series finally over to the Switch to the resounding surprise and excitement of many, including myself. It's just as hard to remember the time where this wasn't the case, where we were begging Nintendo to give us something for the series, where the only consolations we were given were games that were received poorly, or worse, or just silence. So when compared to that, it's even harder for me to imagine the time further past that point, the time when the first game in this series was released. Up until recently, I had never played the original Metroid for the NES before. I wasn't really alive back when it came out. My first game in the series wouldn't be until Metroid Fusion, and my experience there is for another day, but my actual experience with the NES grandfather of the series had only really been comprised of various sessions of play that lasted mere minutes at a time, where I'd reach a point in the game where I got lost, bored, or the ever-present ADHD constant of my life distracted, and gave up. The steep difficulty spike from what I was used to dealing with to the retro-hard difficulty of the game, as I remember it being known as, was also a likely culprit, as I remember dying a lot. But it's always been a curiosity, something I've been interested in sinking my teeth into, to see and experience what exactly started this game series I hold so dear to me. And as of recently, I did just that. And if I have to say one thing out of the gate regarding the game, it would be that much like myself in every waking moment of my life, it's trying its best for as good as its best is. Now, don't take that comment the wrong way. I'm not looking at this game solely as a product of its time. I'm not saying I'm holding it up to today's standards, because that is a really, really unfair bar to hit. I'm looking at this game as simply what it offers to me right now. I know it's an old game. I know that it wasn't designed with the understandings we've come to regarding a variety of the gaming norms that I'm used to now. I know what I'm getting myself into, essentially, but even then, I'm excited to jump into the game. And honestly, why wouldn't I be? Even if the game was released on the NES, it still sold well even back then. It was designed and developed by the team at Nintendo Research and Development 1, or R&D 1 for short, the oldest development team at Nintendo. That was R&D 1, and they were good at what they did. Aside from Metroid, they also developed other classics like Kid Icarus and Donkey Kong. They were the team responsible for the Game Boy line of handhelds, and they were the ones who came up with the Virtual Boy. Look, you win some, you lose some, and Metroid was not something they lost with. One of the main aspects of the Metroid series has to be its atmosphere. Compared to the bright and colorful worlds of Nintendo's other NES hits, Metroid, by comparison, is dark. The title screen itself is enough of an indication, as you're met with a black backdrop of a starry sky on a strange planet, with nothing but the void of space, the title, and the music to accompany you. This atmosphere is felt throughout the game. No matter what area you find yourself in, you are alone. You feel alone. The various hallways that make up the various labyrinths of the main areas of Metroid all tie into this feeling, at times leaving you entirely lost within its world. Albeit not to the game's benefit, but that's a later point. You're neck deep in enemy territory, it's just you, and whatever creepy thing is standing on the other side of the next door. You feel every hit you take, especially near the start when you only have 30 energy to your name. Every step is another taken further into the unknown, and it is weirdly refreshing now that I can properly appreciate it. Of course, one of the biggest attributes that help with getting that atmosphere is the music. The composer of the game, Hirokazu Tanaka, did an amazing job when he was crafting the music of this game. Each track elevates the atmosphere for its respective area or placement perfectly, and there are so many iconic motifs that come from this game that I was honestly a little surprised. A few personal favorites are the title theme, Brinstar's theme, the item collection theme. All three are iconic in their own right. Everyone who's played a Metroid game would immediately be able to pick out the notes for the title theme. The Brinstar theme is the theme you'll likely hear the most of at the start, and the item collection theme is just as catchy and memorable as any of the other songs. Of course, that's not to downplay any of the other tracks present in Metroid. You're going to be exploring almost every inch and cranny of this place, so if there's not variation in the music, things are going to start getting boring, or worse, grating. Each area has its own theme. There's Brinstar, as mentioned before, but there's also themes for the other major areas. Each theme also helps separate the areas further from each other. While there's enough visual stimulus to show you what major area you're in, the music helps just as much, and each track sells you the mood of each area as well. Zebes is big, or at least it feels big. Part of that is due to how it gets you lost, but most of the time it just sells the scale in such a way that it does feel that big. There are 5 areas to Zebes, those being Brinstar, Norfair, Kraid, Ridley, and Torian, each one distinct in both its graphical design and its music. Brinstar is where you'll begin, and this is where most of the basics lie. It's your hub to almost all the other areas. Need to get to Norfair? Go find the elevator in Brinstar. Need to go beat up a lizard both named and located within Kraid? Go find a different elevator. Need to defeat another lizard? One that can fly? Well, you'll need to find the elevator in Norfair, but you can only get to Norfair through Brinstar. Norfair is your standard lava level of sorts. It has more dangerous enemies abound compared to Brinstar, and when you arrive, you might not be prepared for what it has to challenge you with. Kraid and Ridley are sort of the same. The easiest way I can describe them is that they're sort of like more beefed up versions of the areas you reach them through. Ridley is like a more beefed up version of Norfair, in all the ways that that applies. Kraid is of a similar vein, but instead of Norfair, it's Brinstar. At the end of each of those zones, you have a boss, which the areas are named after, and once you defeat them, you can go back up through Brinstar to get to the room that leads to Torian. Before now, what greeted you at this point was a death pit and 2 statues. Before, you could roll into a morph ball and run into the death pit, but now that you've beaten Ridley and Kraid, you can simply shoot their respective statues and unveil a bridge that'll take you right over to the elevator. Compared to the other areas, Torian is vastly different. It's sort of like the inside of a tech lab. Metal walls greet you as you run past, and almost mechanical feel to the place is present when compared to the other zones. It's also just as hard as the others, but not for the same reasons. For now though, let's put a pin in all that, and let's talk about what I imagine a few of you are awaiting me to finally talk about. Gameplay. I've been tiptoeing around this topic for a bit, mainly because I didn't want to end up going on a tangent into other aspects of this game when the meat of it all is really to be covered here. To start with basic controls, you can run to the right and to the left, an action that I imagine was mind-blowing to many young gamers all those years ago. I know it was for me hearing about it secondhand. You can jump, and you can look up. You can fire your cannon, and that's about all you start with. Limitations are what they are, and Metroid was definitely held back by the limitations of the NES. But even knowing that, and pushing past it, it's still a weird feeling just because of how stiff it is to work with. You can't crouch like later games. You can't aim on the diagonal like later games. And don't even assume that 360 aiming is even close to a reality back then. But when you have enemies directly walking below your area of effect, it's an annoyance you'll just have to deal with. Aside from all of that, Metroid at its core is an exploration game. You can go around throughout Zebes looking for various power-ups to make yourself stronger in order to handle the harder challenges presented to you further in. Areas that you would be unable to reach during your prior treks throughout the winding halls of Zebes would suddenly become available paths now that you have an ability to make such a path. 5 missiles can blast open red doors, your bombs can reveal hidden paths in the wall, and your ice beam can be used to make platforms for you to reach higher parts of the map. This concept, this style of gameplay, is the bare bones base of what would eventually be refined and crystallized into the genre known as Metroidvania. However, in the here and now of Metroid on the NES, it's not that. Metroidvania wouldn't be a concept until well into the time of the Super Nintendo, but even so, it's all here. I mean, I just listed all those attributes a second ago. For as exploration heavy as it is, the game is just as much an action game. Those power-ups, those are what are going to keep you alive, and you'd better hope they do. I said at the start that you're given a pitiful 30 energy whenever you start the game, and I do mean whenever you start the game. While the Famicom Disk System version of the game in Japan got an actual save system, we here in the West were not given such a thing. Instead, we got a password system. Said password system, while fun and offered various fun sheets or otherwise to be inputted, meant that there was no start from a save. If you died, it was back to the start of whatever area you died in, and subsequently back down to 30 energy upon continuing. And with how unforgiving the game's difficulty can be at times, be it due to unfairness or just an issue of skill, that 30 energy is going to be an absolute pain to climb back up from, especially if you grabbed any energy tanks along the way to increase your maximum health. Because unlike before, you don't just have one energy tank to fill up, you have multiple. So it's going to take a while. Speaking of specific power-ups, let's go over them. Metroid has a lot of power-ups, each one offering something to help your survivability in the game, and trust me, you can never have too much survivability. There's the Morph Ball, or known in the manual specifically as the Marumari, as I'm sure many are aware at this point. It lets you turn yourself into a ball, because apparently making sprites for crouching animations would have been too much of an issue. I do get it though, especially when you're trying to keep the sprites consistent on like the NES, and in the end we got an iconic item out of that choice, so hey, that worked itself out pretty well. You have the various beam types, the standard power beam you begin the game with, which is just the most pitiful thing in this game. There's the long beam, which lightly increases the strength of said arm cannon and makes the range of your attacks something actually decent. There's the spicy beam types, like the ice and wave beam. The ice beam can freeze enemies solid, making platforms for you to jump up and explore with, as I mentioned earlier, and the wave beam fires out a single beam that moves up and down as it shoots out, covering a wider range of area for you to catch stragglers in. A big help when you can't crouch or aim up or down in the diagonal. Unlike later games, the beams don't stack, however, so when you get one, you lose the other. Then there's, of course, your other methods of damage. The missiles and bombs. Missiles are collected via various missile upgrade packs, which boost your capacity by 5 each. Bombs, on the other hand, are accessed through your Morph Ball. And it's also the tool in which we practice our paranoia by bombing every tile in the room to see if there's a hidden breakable block around. And after all that, you have the other power-ups. These include energy tanks, something of a similar vein to the missile upgrade packs, where there are multiple of them, and each one adds another 100 energy to your health pool. There's the high jump boots and the screw attack, which gives you a greater jump height, and then makes your somersaults deadly, respectively. And finally, the Varia suit. It's a bit disappointing that all it does is make you pink, especially when compared to later entries where the whole design changes, but this was, again, on the NES. And I certainly wasn't going to complain about the vastly improved defenses this suit gave you. 50% less damage taken is a blessing. You'll find all of these power-ups scattered throughout Zebes in the various areas, and each one brings with it the feeling of strength. By the time you're at the end of the game, you will breeze through past areas that had been rage-inducing earlier. That feeling is liberating. And you have all of that to explore Zebes with, and... okay, well, let's talk about an issue I do have with the game. Everything looks the same. There are so many hallways and shafts that all look and have the same layouts and sprites that it just blends together and leaves you feeling lost. You'll likely find yourself lost in the world, not because you're immersed, but because you actually are lost. Limitations are limitations, but the guys at R&D 1 could have done something differently, right? You also might notice I haven't really been talking about the story of Metroid, and there's a reason for that. While later entries have more to say and share regarding the events and what's going on, the original doesn't have a lot of that at all, at least within the game proper anyways. Much like many others, a lot of the game story is left within the confines of the user manual, and I can see why it was. To summarize, because there's a lot of detail, It's a year far into the future, and the Galactic Federation has a lot of issues with the space pirates, a faction of aliens that are just being an absolute menace to the galaxy and the Federation as a result. In response, the Federation employs bounty hunters in an attempt to curb said space pirate activity. This was the basic status quo for a while. Well, at least it was until the inciting incident of the game. The space pirates had attacked a research vessel containing a creature in suspended animation, said creature known as a Metroid. A Metroid has the abilities to suck the life and energy out of a creature, and when it is exposed to beta rays for 24 hours, they will split apart and multiply. Of course, because they're space pirates and this kind of thing would be right up their alley, the Metroids very quickly started being made into bioweapons for them. And that is where the player comes in. Due to the threat of the Metroids and the fact that the space pirate base is really well fortified, enough that the Galactic Federation literally can't penetrate its defenses, they call upon the galaxy's greatest bounty hunter to do the job for them. Samus Aran, the power-suited protagonist of the series, is called in to assist. And that's it. We're told that we need to defeat Ridley and Kraid, the two bosses of the space pirates, and then we need to defeat the big bad of them all in Torian. Otherwise, we're on our own, and we are certainly ready for whatever is coming our way, assuming we explore for power-ups, anyways. Making your way down through each of the areas and defeating both Kraid and Ridley will unlock the way to Torian, the last area of the game, as I've said previously. Defeating them will also give you 75 missiles each, which is greatly appreciated because you are absolutely going to need them. Torian is not a victory lap. I'd like to call it one, but it's not. It's the final gauntlet. The area is swarming with the game's namesake, and they can only be defeated by being frozen with the ice beam and then blasting it with missiles 5 times. By the time you reach the room before the final boss, you'd better spend some time recharging your health and ammunitions, because it is brutal if you don't, and just as brutal if you did. You don't really fight Mother Brain. It's more like you're fighting their security system. Throughout your run down Torian, you have been under siege by both Metroids and these rings of energy. Those rings return during this fight, and when you need to deal with both them and turrets that will rotate and fire every once in a while, it becomes a challenge of multitasking. A challenge I admittedly failed at quite a few times. But the game isn't over once you break open the glass shield housing Mother Brain. It isn't over once you've overfed them with missiles until they go boom. It's over after you get off of Zebes, and coincidentally, once you outrun the self-destruct sequence, another staple of this franchise that I can never get enough of. The Zebes base is rigged to blow upon Mother Brain's defeat, so running and jumping up the various platforms in the shaft behind Mother Brain's tube is our only real option. The game gives you enough time to get to the elevator at the top, with room for a few missed jumps, if they happen, and once you reach the elevator, that's it. You did it! And now having beaten the game, well, it's time for congratulations. And as like Snake once said,
Mei Ling, Samus took her clothes off.
Okay, up to this point, I haven't really talked much about Samus. Bluntly speaking, if there was more to talk about her, trust me, I would be. Samus doesn't have a lot to her in this first entry. Not until the end of the game. Until then, they were just an armored suit dude running around shooting things as your stand-in. And I do mean it when I say dude. Unlike now, this was a massive surprise for gamers back then. Until that reveal, Samus had always been referred to as male even in the instruction manual. So when you get to the end and you see this, someone, I assume, had to have been blown away by that reveal. It also leads me into the why this happened, or at least why this screen was the one you could have gotten when you beat the game. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first spark of speedrunning, or at least one of the major ones. It wouldn't be until much later, like Super Metroid kind of later, that the concept would really pick up speed, but it was here as well. Depending on how quickly you beat the game, you would get various endings depending on your time. The ending you got for finishing the time the fastest was this shot right here, of Samus in a bikini. And once you do finish the game, and assuming you get one of the endings where Samus is fully out of the power suit, you can start a continue immediately after and start from the beginning of the game again. Only this time, suitless. It's only cosmetic, as you would take the same damage and control the same, but it's a fun addition for replayability. One that I admittedly kind of wish they'd bring back in one form or another in later games. It would make no sense, absolutely it wouldn't, but if it was a bonus for finishing the game under a certain time, I don't think I'd care that it didn't make sense at that point. I already finished the game, what's a little broken immersion at that point? Of course, speedrunning the game for one of the suitless endings isn't the only way to start the game suitless. Thanks to the password system in the NES version, there are various codes that allow Samus to be played suitless. The most famous one is the Justin Bailey code, which when implemented drops you into Norfair with a shit ton of unlocks. It's the most famous, but not the only code that has you start suitless, as all it takes is the suitless flag to be activated by the password to start you with it. And speaking of fun passwords, there's also the debug code Narpus Sword, which gives you infinite health and infinite missiles and all power-ups. Overall, a fun code if you want to go around just being an unstoppable killing machine in this game. And then there's Engage Ridley Mother***er. If you don't know what this code does, and admittedly I didn't until recently as well, it makes the game think the player has been playing the game for over 314 years non-stop. This, expectantly, has catastrophic effects. On the original NES release, there were various graphical and software glitches that occurred as a result of this, while later releases, like on Nintendo Switch Online, simply forced the game to crash when entered. And the funny thing about that is that the Ridley flag for him being defeated is already checked in that password, so you can't even do what it wants you to do. Funnily enough, when I first went into this to record and play through the game, I was expecting to have a bad time with it. And for a bit, I definitely did. There was a lot that was working against me when I had first started going through the game, a lot of growing pains and learning curves I had to figure out, but once I had gotten past all of that, once I had really gotten a handle of the game, I was having fun. I was having a lot of fun. Like, a surprising amount of fun. It was almost as fun as some of the later games in the series. At times, even more for some. I played through the game twice, because it was that much fun for me. On your first run, you'll get lost, and while I tried to go through the game without using a guide or map, there were admittedly one or two spots I had to cave to do so. But on my second playthrough, I honestly don't remember if I did use one. I remember remembering the path I needed to take, the way to use the least amount of time to my advantage to get a better ending. I started this by saying Metroid was trying its best. I stand by that. Its best is good. Great even. But even with all that, there are so many little things that also hurt it. The controls, stiff and needed more refinement. The difficulty in enemies, too brutal or too easy, and that changed on the drop of a hat sometimes depending on your area. The music? No, wait, that was perfectly fine. The point I'm trying to make, the point I want to make, is that Metroid on the NES was a spark. It was an amalgamation of ideas and systems that could not fully be realized on the hardware it was releasing on. And even then, this old relic put its best foot forward and still did amazing. Metroid, the ideas and concepts and gameplay, all of it had so much potential. So while all of that might have been chained to the hardware of the NES at the start, it's even better now to know that it didn't stay there, and that it did break free and grow. And considering it did, well, the last Metroid is not in captivity. Wonder if the galaxy's at peace right now. Thanks to everyone who watched this. I've been working away at this video for what feels like 3 different revisions, and only now found a good time to really finish this up. Whatever comes after this is still up in the air. I have ideas, but some might be a bit too ambitious for me, so I don't have anything yet to point you all towards. If you liked what I did, why not subscribe? And if you really liked it, well, I do hear there's a button for that kind of thing. But in all seriousness, if you watched through this whole video and are listening to me babble on in the end, thank you. It means a lot. And when I do get the next video out, I hope you look forward to it as well. Gianna.